It's now February 1st, 2024, and more people are reaching the conclusion that something isn't quite right with the comic book industry. It's a little bit late for a lot of these people to realize that, and unfortunately, those who are have nothing to contribute other than the same old quote unquote solutions, the ones that haven't worked for years. And the author of this article is one of them. This is an article by Popverse titled "To Save Marvel and DC Comics, They Need to Be More Experimental and Take More Risks, but so do readers." This guy uses experimental way too much, and the subtext here is this: the year the two big publishers listen to those who want comics to return to a nostalgic golden era. They put that right under the title. When we get to the conclusion of the article, you'll see that they pretty much contradict everything that it says. It says, as if 2023 was drawing to a close, there was much public discussion about what was needed in order to save the comic book specialty marketplace, with much of that commentary coming unusually from professionals inside the industry itself. Yeah, it was unusual to see all these people finally coming out of the woodwork and realizing, oh, we screwed up. Famously, former Marvel heavyweight Mark Millar suggested that big-name creators return to Marvel and DC, saying that excitement is contagious. Big names on big characters is a very fun idea. Imagine if, one, you had creators that people trusted and whose work they enjoyed, but also creators who could keep their personal psychosis and political opinions to themselves and simply promote their comic, to demonstrate that they're actually excited about the work they're doing in order to convince the fans that we should be excited about their work. Continues at saying that led other creators to respond, including Scott Snyder's contention that a shift also needs an ideological shift inside the publishers and amongst the readers alike to truly land. Now, demanding that you get an ideological shift among the readers is stupid and entitled. We're willing to give you our money if you're making something that we want. Your job is to figure out what we want and make that. Our job is to give you feedback, not to contain or alter our personal ideology and just consume. While specific prescriptions for the problem differed, one thing appeared to be agreed upon. Something needed to change, and quickly. So as 2024 rolls around, the obvious question is, what happens now? And then it goes on to talk about the dawn of DC. Something that should be considered is that there's an argument to be made that DC has been attempting a variation of what some have been demanding for the past year already, courtesy of the Dawn of DC initiative, a focus on the big-name characters with the biggest creators of the company today. That's been a success for DC, and has certainly raised DC's profile inside the existing comic book market. But this hasn't been noted by those who believe that big names on big characters will change the industry. Why not? So, I have heard that the main Superman comic is pretty good. But then you have people like Chip Zdarsky writing Batman, which whose bright idea was that? And that's the problem, is it says you have a focus on the big name characters with the biggest creators at the company today. So you have today's superstars, but when you compare them to the superstars from even 2 decades ago, the gap in talent is enormous. For some of these newer creators, that gap is nearly insurmountable. It's unfortunate that, I don't know if they need new hiring practices or if they need to be harder on their creators when they're working there. But to be blunt, the new crowd, and when I say new crowd, I mean the crowd from the past decade or so, just isn't up to snuff. They're not meeting the standard that fans came to expect. So having the biggest creators who are there at the company today isn't good enough. It doesn't do enough to respect the legacy of these big characters and all the work put into them by, frankly, more talented writers and artists. It goes on to say, part of it might be that Dawn of DC didn't shift things enough for that audience. They wanted something with the impact of, say, 2011's New 52 relaunch that reestablished DC as the biggest publisher in the business, at least temporarily. And possibly another might be that the big names that are part of the Dawn of DC initiative aren't who those demanding this kind of thing think of as big. Exactly. Like I said, we're not thinking of Chip Zdarsky when we think of big creators, especially not for a flagship character like Batman. And I also wouldn't use the New 52 as the benchmark. The New 52 was fairly popular for the first year or so, but the audience quickly realized that they didn't have a solid plan behind it. And also, people didn't like the changes to the mainstream characters. It continues in saying, I keep coming back to Mark Millar's initial suggestion of this idea and his mentioning Joss Whedon and John Byrne as the kind of talents necessary to make this happen, suggesting an attitude rooted as much in nostalgia as anything else, and a desire that will never be satisfied because of practical reasons. Now, I haven't heard anyone out there clamoring for Joss Whedon, though personally, I would love to see John Byrne come back to either DC or Marvel. Though, as it says here, John Byrne hasn't been a creator for a while. Nostalgia versus new voices. My attention turns to something that Grant Morrison wrote in a recent newsletter. Another veteran of the old days. I guess I'm 30 years old, so I wouldn't consider Grant Morrison to be a veteran. And seeing the profile picture of this article's author, that guy's a lot older than me, so I don't know why he would consider Morrison to be a veteran either. Like, to me, veteran is like the pre-2000s guys. People like John Byrne. Feel free to argue about that in the comments. He says, for a younger generation of creators to fix what seems broken to them. Comics like pop music, I think he meant to say relish there, on fresh voices to sing the old standards in a way that resonates with the new audience. I would disagree with that. I personally don't like hearing old standards sung by new singers. And, there's that new audience thing again, this new audience that Marvel and DC have been trying to find. However, by the sales numbers, they don't seem to exist. But they're simultaneously pushing out the core audience that's existed in some cases for decades and have really held up the industry as it is now. That might be the answer to re-energizing Marvel and DC in terms of sales, if not the vocal minority of those wishing Joss Whedon came back to comics. Again, I don't know who's out there begging Joss Whedon to come back. The idea of finding new voices that resonate with readers in such a way as to build a new audience that will ideally grow to sample other comics and become voracious readers across the board. You know how you organically grow a new generation of readers? You keep the readers that you have. You maintain the core audience, make sure that they always feel a desire to invest in the industry, because they will pass on the comics to their kids, and they'll pass on the idea of reading comics to their kids, and hopefully you're still making something that those kids want to read at that point. Pushing out the old audience in favor of the trendy, Gen Z audience that exists now is stupid. You don't create a taller building by knocking out the foundations. And right now, Marvel and DC don't have a foundation. It's crumbling. But here's where it comes to the conclusion of this article, and I think the solution contradicts what the subtitle said. He says, perhaps the true solution is a combination of both approaches, bringing back big-name creators for top-tier characters, while building a new generation of creators, creating new voices for a new audience on other books throughout the line. Simultaneously, with an eye to those creators inheriting the top titles in time, leaving space for the next generation of creators to come in as the newer voices and so on. The problem is hiring practices. They need to hire competent writers and artists. Period. If they don't do that, if they're not willing to be harder on their writers and artists, if the higher-ups aren't willing to be harder on the editors, then bringing back older generation writers and artists and continuously cycling in new people isn't going to help anybody. If every new generation of new writers and artists can't build a foundation of trust with the audience, then it doesn't matter how many new people you bring in. You need to change the hiring culture. You need to change the culture in general. It goes on to say, it's a simple theory and one that should be workable in practice. But in order for it to truly succeed, a bigger change needs to occur than any publishing or editorial initiative. And here's where they go completely wrong. Comic book readers and creators need to become more open to something other than their own needs and desires when it comes to their favorite characters. So ignore what you want and just consume so that the comic industry can continue. Stop wanting to see good stories. Stop wanting badass characters. Just take what's in front of you. Continue paying higher and higher prices for lower quality comics because that's the only way the industry survives. Well, that's not an industry that should survive. If they're being beat out by competition or they're simply not of high enough quality to stand on their own as it is, then they shouldn't. It'd be sad to see Marvel and DC completely shut down. Not that I believe that would happen, but to believe that the solution is for creators, let alone audiences, to turn away, to pretend we don't see what's going on with the industry, to not voice our disapproval when we're spending outrageous amounts of money for crap comics. That's insane. That's not a solution. That's basically what we've been doing for the past 10 to 20 years. It ends saying, just imagine an industry where publishers had the freedom to create the kind of experimental work that fans consistently dream of returning to without having to cater to fans who demand the kind of work that was experimental decades earlier. They keep using the word experimental. And you know what? Who's asking for experimental? This is a false dichotomy. It has to be experimental from today or experimental from a decade ago. You know what fans want? We want a solid comic. Our standards are that low at this point. We want a solid story. They need to return to a solid foundation. And it's not going to fix it right away. It's going to take years to rebuild the goodwill of the fans, to rebuild the trust that we're going to continue investing our time and money into these comics and that the companies are going to provide us something of value. Similar to the MCU has been falling apart for the past 4 or 5 years. Even if Deadpool 3 is the most amazing superhero movie that has ever existed, it's not going to fix things. That's one movie. It's going to take possibly as many years as it took for the MCU to fall apart, or the clamor and for the hype of the MCU to return to what it was. You can't just make a one-off. You have to be consistent. You can be experimental once you've rebuilt your foundation. That's what Marvel and DC need to do right now. Just put out solid stories. Be consistent. Win back the audience. Experiment later. Now, the biggest problem that I see is the lack of willingness to break the status quo. And it's something that I brought up in my review of Ultimate Spider-Man #1, because I think Peter Parker is the best example of this. But let me quickly turn to DC for a second. So DC, they'll reboot, and that allows them to more organically change things up. You know, Crisis on Infinite Earths in '86, Infinite Crisis in 2006, I think, and then Final Crisis in 2009, Flashpoint and the New 52 in 2011, Rebirth in 2015, 2020 had Death Metal, I think, and then a couple years later, Dark Crisis, and then Future State was before Dark Crisis, and then Dawn of DC now. So DC's problem is that they're too quick to reboot. What they need to do is, again, build a solid foundation. They need to redefine their identity and go from there. That's just a starting point. But that's what fans need to see right now. We need to see that they're actually willing to recognize what the problems are and create a true fresh start where they're building a foundation, not a half-ass reboot where you're just taking the same stuff from before and creating a new crisis event out of it. But to go back to Spider-Man, what I talked about in my review of Ultimate Spider-Man #1 is that what I liked was that it was a fresh take, that Spider-Man, spoilers, other than the fact that Peter hadn't been bitten by the spider yet, he was also 35 years old. He was happily married. His life was going pretty well, which is the opposite of 616 Peter. 616 Peter is always a bachelor. He's always having trouble keeping a job. He's always in the same spot in his life. They never let him move on. They never let him grow as a character. They don't let him age. He's been in his mid to late 20s for a few decades now. And from the fan response to Ultimate Spider-Man #1, I think it's obvious people want to see Peter and MJ get back together. If you want new creators to be able to do experimental things, then you need to allow the current status quo to change. You need to allow characters to age and to grow so that we can move along with those characters. If you want a legacy character like Miles Morales to become the Spider-Man, you can't have Peter Parker who's still in his prime. It doesn't make sense to replace him. And it's not organic when you just kill him off suddenly, because we know it's just about bringing Miles Morales to the forefront. They need to enact true change. Marvel needs to break the status quo. DC needs to redefine their brand. Both of them need to return to a solid foundation to put out just solid work, solid, consistent work, and then you build from there. The solution certainly is not for fans and creators to just consume. Don't give a crap and consume. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you would hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.